everybody. I'm sure you got an email about a presentation on this topic, and by the way, I hope my accent isn't too difficult to understand. I will speak slowly for everybody. So I'm sure you got an email about this topic, and were I very excited, or what you could actually learn from a 25-year-old CEO. It's quite odd saying that, I know. I definitely feel odd at most times being in a room with 65-year-old ministers who don't understand the vision that I want to articulate. But it has been an exciting roller coaster in a position for about 2 years now. So, as you all might know, my name is Jai, Mirchandani, and I came into this role about 2.5 years ago, just growing up in America, not really knowing exactly what it is I wanted to achieve in life. I was, in many ways, sort of obliged to join in a lot of ways. Hello? All right, I think this is better. In many ways, I was sort of obliged to join the family business and figure things out from there. So I left America at the age of 22 and a half, about 23, and moved to West Africa, specifically Ghana, which is where the business currently is. And we're in the agribusiness sector. We do palm oil, rice, and soap. Products that I didn't really have much engagement with over the years or experience with. But one thing was interesting was that I went there with the passion to sort of give the same privileges to the people that didn't have them. And I mean that I had a very privileged lifestyle growing up in New York. And I wanted to bring that same prosperity to a lot of people. And one of the things I'm really going to harp on today is that with anything you do in life, whatever profession you go into, it's possible to dream your utopia and actually make it happen. I would say that the vehicle that I've been given is extremely, extremely powerful because I am the largest company in a country of about 26 million people. And so I do have an ability to touch all hearts and minds with such a large entity. And I'm sure all of you have your own dreams and ambitions, and I'm sure will be given a vehicle of this sort, however large or small it is, to actualize that. So without further ado, I'd like to get into my presentation and talk to you a little bit about 10 unconventional things that make me an unconventional man in the bow tie that I wear. Definitely do this every day, so if this is weird for you, I'm glad it is, because that's just how I like to be, and I hope all of you will grow to embrace that as well. So one of my first points, oddly enough, is become an engineer. There are a lot of jokes in my household because I'm kind of the guy that will eat something, spill it on his shirt, break the toilet after I have a party. There's so many things that I've done that I get sort of joked on about. And my sister is the smart one, and she comes in, cleans it up, fixes it, and makes me look bad, basically. And she's an engineer. So why be an engineer? Why become an engineer? I don't use the word be because I think that there's an essence of existence to that. And so I use the word becoming because something like an engineer is a very dynamic kind of concept. We shouldn't think of it as static or limited to a certain scope of works like chemistry or biology and whatnot. So I'll give you a few examples where I actually have demonstrated this. We've been in the project management phase for about 2 years that I've been running the company, and we've been building our rice mill and our soap plant. And one of the things I realized that it's really important to understand the interlinkages in the production process, for example, and how that affects your entire business model. So where I went into a business not exactly knowing what these products could do for people, I went down to the roots and sort of got myself to understand how the production process works and how I could actually tailor-make that to fit the needs of society. Another way I was involved in becoming engineer-like was in a very managerial position. I went into an organization which was run by a brigadier who had all the control and completely wielded his influence over each and every decision. And I had to disrupt that model and understand what it is that people really wanted to feel empowered and do their work. And so in that sense, I had to engineer the right organizational change to allow for our model to be sustainable internally and externally. And then the other thing, I mentioned here the circumstance and the struggle. It's really important in terms of the innovation process as a company to understand what it is you're innovating to. You're always innovating to a circumstance. There's always the who, the what, the why, the how, the when of a given circumstance, and you're there to meet that need and disrupt what it is that's actually being given at the moment and by providing a better product and service combination. Okay, so yes, this is sort of self-explanatory, but not really. Why do I say this? All of you are probably going to ask me if I eat meat. I do. So I'm kind of working on this one myself. But why I say this is there's an extreme amount of science that really supports this, and I'm sure a lot of you vegetarians are going to tell your meat-eating friends, oh, listen to this guy, or don't listen to this guy. But essentially, in terms of productivity theory, if we look at animals that have been carnivores, they spend about 20 to 22 hours in a day sleeping. And in terms of productivity theory, that would be impossible to make the world work the way it does. Our digestive tracts are not able to break down meat in the same way it's able to break down vegetables and grains, for example, so we do see a huge benefit in terms of productivity. In terms of water usage and climate change, it's extremely sustainable to actually be vegetarian. There's an estimate that said fracking oil uses about 10 billion gallons of water in a given year, whereas animal agriculture uses 34 trillion. So we could actually save and really avert a lot of climate change. And there's another study by the World Bank that says 51% of all greenhouse gas emissions actually are due to animal agriculture. So depending on which way you look at it, it's extremely sustainable. I don't know how many of you like hamburgers, but essentially a quarter pounder takes 660 gallons of water, which is equivalent to 2 minutes of showering for 2 months. So there's so many things that could be averted, and the Mediterranean diet, which is one based on beans, fruits, grains, and a slight amount of fish, is actually known to actually give a lot of longevity to your life. So a lot of the things I'm going to tell you here are causes and conditions that can actually contribute to your well-being and therefore improve your productivity to thus impact society in the best way. So this is not going to teach you how to be the most powerful person in the world. It's not going to teach you how to get where I am, because I would all like for you to be well and above where I am. But essentially, these are just a few things that could sort of make you understand the picture a little bit more holistically. One of the things I've noticed, when you move from a country like America where people are very accepting, and you go someplace like West Africa, and you look like a funny guy when you wear clothes like this, and when you're walking in the street, you don't really feel welcome. But I took a jump this year for the first time, and I decided, you know what, I'm going to explore more things in Ghana and sort of just try to be one with the people. So I started wearing a lot of their clothing, started just going to music festivals and art shows. One of the most famous ones is called the Chale Wote, and basically it's like this annual festival of like music. It's a street fair as well as the arts, which displays all works in Ghana's atmosphere and environment at that time. And it really there's a huge interlinkage between what's actually displayed and the political crisis. And there is a political crisis going on in Ghana. And it's amazing how much I was able to learn from art. You know, something that was always so abstract to me, but I was able to actually see what elements of suffering are persisting in society as a result of, you know, this expressiveness. So I would encourage you, in terms of trying to meet the various needs, once again, of society, to really go out in the streets and just see things on your own. You'd be able to really garner a lot of ideas and garner a lot of support, because more often than not, you will be with your friends, you know, looking and enjoying these events. One of the other things I want to mention, I talk about risk-reward here, and risk-reward is a standard thing we learn in financial theory, which is just so outdated in so many ways. I mean, innovation today should be demand-driven. It is happening at such a fast pace. It's bigger, it's leaner, and I don't think we need to approach innovation with a risk aversion anymore, saying that the more risk we put in, the more reward we're going to get. I think if things can be worked backwards in terms of understanding what demand and circumstance we're innovating to and what struggle we're trying to help overcome for the consumer or the customer, we'll be able to actually innovate in a much faster, leaner, better, more systemic way. So a lot of that has to do with really putting yourself out there and seeing what solutions might be drawn to you as opposed to you searching them out in a laboratory, for example. All right, so I guess we know this one. This is pretty much a standard social entrepreneurship kind of theme. And most people say put doing good with doing well, but I don't really say that, because I think that you have to really understand what it is you want to effectuate first. And if you want to effectuate your pocket, you're going to do doing well before doing good. But if you're not, and if your mission is wholly sustainable, you will put doing good before doing well. I'll give you a few examples in a minute of how put doing good is better than doing well. Simon Kuznets. Does anyone know who Simon Kuznets was? He was the guy who came up with GDP. You know, he won the Nobel Peace Prize, Nobel Prize in somewhere in the 1930s for coming up with this heuristic. And everyone thought he was, you know, the coolest guy in the world. And you know, one of the things he said to all governments was, please don't use this metric as a measurement of prosperity. But I guess nobody listened. So, and a lot of the reasons why he said that was because there are things like pollution, education, the negative and positive externalities that are not really taken into account. And we see more and more sustainable models of business actually putting doing good before doing well. And because we're not capturing that, we're not accurately measuring social economic development. And so I encourage all of you not to look at things, you know, from what people give you, but in terms of what you're searching out for. CSV and Michael Porter, that's a classic example of Harvard's Michael Porter, who's a former starter of Bain Capital, and he talks about creating shared value, which is the concept of moving away from CSR, because CSR was the concept of really fulfilling the needs of what society asks of corporations. That's simply what it's defined as: the legal, the economic, the political and social parameters that people expect of corporations. But that model is kind of static, as it doesn't evolve in the same way that the term creating shared value does, and rising to the task of meeting the value of all those parameters as well as meeting the value of the in-house corporation. The power of the corporation today. Anyone know that Apple was richer than the US government? I mean, everyone was talking about that probably a year and a half ago. And it just tells you that really, I mean, we know that lobbying exists. We know that, you know, corporate interests are definitely ahead of the individual interests. But we don't always have to brand that in such a bad way. Sometimes we have to harness the power for the betterment of all of us, and that's why I feel extremely privileged to be in the position that I'm in. You know, someone has told me before, you know, Jay, why don't you focus on the bottom line? But if you focus on the bottom line, you're doing everything at the expense of something else. Why do that when you can take a more inclusionary model and just make it sustainable? A few business cases. Revolution Foods is a California-based company, and they looked at studies between, you know, obesity and the meals that were being served in San Francisco schools. And one of the things they found was that where a subsidy is present, obesity will actually decrease in states where there are mandated requirements for healthy meals to be served. And so basically what they did was they came up with this social mission that they wanted to solve obesity. And they basically got on board the National Lunch School Program, which is a nonprofit that provides subsidies for schools up to about $3 to $5, depending on the size of the meal. And they brought them on board and basically tried to devise a model where they could serve healthy lunches to all these kids. And their model is now over 100 million in revenue. They serve about 1,000 schools in the San Francisco area, and they're working to scale that up. So it's really an amazing model, and they began with their social mission first. And so that's an example of something successful that started with the social mission, and it's a fairly recent example. Legatum Capital is a Dubai-based investment firm. And generally when you think of financial firms, you're always thinking, you know, these guys are just in it for the money. But something really important to note here is that they have a foundation where they give pre-tax profits to. And they actually look at their foundation as an investment arm. So one of the things they've done as of recent is because they're really bullish on countries like Ethiopia, which are growing at enormous rates, they're focused on bringing the human capital level up to a level of sustainability. They found that there's a huge gap between retention rates in school and those actually being enrolled in school. And so over time, what would happen is people would be enrolled, but then, you know, the retention would drop out and they wouldn't be fulfilling the majority of their education. So from, let's say from like years 8 to 12, they wouldn't be fulfilling, and then obviously that would not allow them to progress into society better. So what would happen, what they found was that they were going to implement speed schools, and speed schools were basically going to take these kids who had been dropped out of school for about 4 years and simply accelerate their training, which would then allow them to get back into the public school system and then, you know, be feeders into society. And so yeah, it really, with a variety of firms, you can really use your social mission to leverage the kind of value that you want to create. Everyone knows Ben & Jerry's, I think. Fantastic ice cream, awesome marketing. And Ben & Jerry's actually didn't start as a company with a social mission. You know, over time, they became the iconic social purpose corporation, which was, you know, good to its cows, good to its people, good to the environment, etc. But Ben & Jerry's was bought out by Unilever for about, from the founders, for about 50 million, about 2000, I believe. And what's interesting here is that any corporation that wanted to be taken over could actually be thwarted from taking over as a result of that deal or merger and acquisition not being favorable to society. So Ben & Jerry's actually did not have to sell out their corporation, and nowadays they get a lot of heat for it. Why? Because they didn't pursue their social mission of saving their company, which would have kept the employees, the people, the environment, etc. very happy. And now they're run by a corporate and sort of dictated what to do. I mean, Unilever says that they're a subsidiary, but really, the values transcend from the top. So in terms of anyone who's wanting to start a social enterprise or has a social mission in mind that they would like to solve, definitely talk to a lawyer before you do that. I don't know how many of you guys meditate, but there are so many studies that link meditation with successful people. I guess talk about celebrities, and I mean, one can argue what they've done to yoga is great, but I mean, one can also argue the complete opposite. I mean, instead of things being a fad, which I find with this whole mindfulness in business kind of theme, I think we should do it more for ourselves, and especially in the position that I'm in, I find that it's extremely stressful to manage all the personalities I have to manage. I have about 9 employees reporting directly to me. I'm also consulting for our Nigeria operations, which is about 3 times the size of our industries in Ghana. And I really have a shortage of time. And one of the things I've found is sort of making time for the things that really help you in making your job easier. And I have found meditation really does that for me. And whether that's 5 minutes, in the office where I'm just not answering any calls, or whether it's just being present, I think, there are a lot of studies that talk about really just being present and meditating while eating, meditating while talking, and like meditating is not keeping your brain inactive. On the contrary, it's mindful activation of the mind. It's really just being one with your entire entity at that moment. So there are the various schools of meditation, Vipassana and whatnot, but that's something I'm not going to really harp on here. But in terms of its benefits to productivity and to the mind in general, we see that it really improves the neuron connectivity. So it's as good as really practicing an instrument in a lot of ways. You're creating more interlinkages between your brain. The response time to things is a lot faster over time. And it helps with mind wandering, which is one of the things I'm going to talk about a little bit later. Mind wandering is an interesting thing. We want it for creative purposes, and I'll explain that. But at the same time, it triggers anxiety, fear, and stress within our entire bodies. So they've devised a method, and I can send you guys a little bit more information on this about mindfulness-based stress reduction. It's like an 8-week course where it sort of just augments the amount of meditation you do, and it's really contributed to a lot of things. Learning and memory is one of the things that's really helped, which is specifically in the hippocampus area of your brain. And then the decrease in the amygdala, which is what I talked about with the stress, fear, and anxiety. And I can't really stress this enough, how important it is to actually be in control of yourself at times. I'll have employees coming to my office asking me, we provide basically all the amenities for employees that we hire, expat employees. Generally, most of them are from India. And people will come into my office, or they used to come into my office and say, Mr. Mirchandani, I don't have enough forks and knives in my house. And I'm like, well, I can't really help you there because I'm a CEO, so I don't really know how to solve that problem for you. But if somebody comes into your office and keeps telling you stuff like that, you know, you're gonna get frustrated after a while. So, you know, you're gonna come across people with all sorts of colors. I just want you to be prepared for that, and I think this is one of the ways you can sort of mitigate that risk. All right. This is probably one of the coolest slides. Align your company's vision with your utopia. There's a spiritual leader by the name of Anthony Strano. I'm not going to bring too much spirituality into this. It's one of the things I really love, but I'm going to try to steer away from it. But it really relates in this scenario of the equilateral triangle, which is obviously something that comes from ancient Greece. And the three motivations for successful human beings actually lead to the construction of the equilateral triangle in ancient Greece. And those are the sense of self-identity, the sense of contribution, and the sense of purpose. So these are the three things that require humans to be motivated to continue on their journey path or whatever it is their vision is in terms of trying to actualize things. And I thought that was really interesting because when I read a strategy article by former Booz Allen and Hamilton, and it talks about the teal organization. And the teal organization is a paradigm that exists today within very few companies, but it's growing to be the dominant paradigm. And they talk about power structures in humanity and how you know, we all started off as a red organization, let's say about 40,000 years ago. And a red organization was something like an army, where it was controlled by a general and power was the main motive. And as you go through this article, it talks about how power has been more and more decentralized over various decades. And so from a red organization, it goes to an orange organization, which is something like government bureaucracy, where there is more power at the bottom, and then an amber organization, which is something like a Wall Street bank, where there are KPIs or accountability metrics, and then something like a Starbucks, which is a green organization, which empowers people. And a lot of us would stop there and say that, okay, Starbucks does great for the environment, it does great for its employees, but can you do more than that? That's really the question. And that's really what this article and this paradigm is getting at, that there's something new called a teal organization. And the three facets of a teal organization relate greatly to what we talked about, the equilateral triangle. The equilateral triangle being the sense of self-identity, contribution, and purpose required to make individuals successful. But now, what can make an organization successful? And the three motivations to make a teal organization, or to characterize a teal organization, are one of self-management, which relates to self-identity, one of wholesomeness, which relates to contribution, and the evolutionary purpose, which relates to sense of purpose. And it's interesting how you see the alignment between the organization and the organization becoming, the individual rather, and the organization becoming an organism. And it's really parallel. Two examples that I want to talk about here. These are probably companies you've never heard of. I never heard of them before I read this piece. And they're both in the healthcare sector. Heiligenfeld is a Germany-based nursing home and clinic. And one of the things they've done, they've mastered wholesomeness quite well, I would say, and self-management, because they work on autonomous work teams. They have a support staff which is very minimal. It's less than 50 people for an employee base of about 600. And obviously that's really providing the legal and administrative work. But most of the work is done at the bottom with the nurses. And one of the things they've implemented, they found that silence is an effective technique in actually improving the well-being of many patients. And so 4 days a year, instead of talking, they actually whisper to one another. and they found that patients' health actually improved as a result. So this is an example of what I talk about in the beginning, whereby the practices that you implement may not actually improve the financial bottom line, but they will improve the well-being. And potentially, if you keep tweaking that model, you might see benefits in the financial bottom line as well. Another one is Buurtzorg, and one thing that makes, this is a Dutch healthcare operator, and one thing that makes the Dutch model so interesting is that this was a model that started in the 1900s. And it didn't start as a corporation, it started within government. And government basically had it mandated that there had to be a nurse within every geography in the country that would service a certain amount of households. But what they found was somewhere in the 1980s or 1990s, they started fabricating this model into a corporation whereby you had to call the nurse and things were much more centralized, whereas in the past they were decentralized according to the various geographies that these nurses operated in. And they found that they had to switch the model back to the old way. And so in many ways, what's really interesting is that these models have existed in various forms for some time. The Teal organization has existed. It's just that now it's becoming a movement. And one of the actually startling findings that many nurses in that organization found was that if you realign items in the house, you could actually prevent a lot of hip breakages in the elder employees. And so they went to the CEO and they told the CEO, can we implement this? He said, you have all the authority in the world to implement this, and this is not my decision. So they went ahead and they started this program where they actually design houses for the benefit of various patients as a preventive mechanism to ensure their well-being. And the CEO, in fact, his name is De Block, and he consults actually for two competitors in this space. One of the things he says is that competition is useless. Change happens at a much more rapid pace, and if we embrace that, the things that we're working for, which are solutions for society, will be much more pervasive. So lipstick. You're probably wondering why I'm talking about lipstick. So this is an interesting example of how corporate social responsibility, or CSV, creating shared value, has been really, really successful. But one thing I want to talk about here is it's extremely important that we don't do things narcissistically, and we don't do things for ourselves. We do it for the actual purpose that we're intending it for. The MAC AIDS Fund is interesting. I'm sure all of you guys know MAC. I mean, you guys and girls, of course. Basically, every year, MAC sells this. MAC donates a portion of this Viva Glam funds. So they sell this lipstick. The funds come in to the tune of about $50 million are donated to the MAC AIDS Fund. And it's run as a separate entity. It just uses the brand equity of MAC to further its mission and its cause. One of the things we realize is how unbranded efforts can actually be just as strong in their contribution to the mission as branded efforts. I gave you a few of the examples before where social missions were embedded into corporations, but this is a great example of how you're able to generate buzz, conversation, and actually effectuate a cause. So one of the things the MAC AIDS Fund found was that a lot of the money that was being given for AIDS cause was not actually helping the areas that needed to be most effectuated, which was that a lot of kids from age 20, 25 all the way down to 10 were more prevalent with AIDS. And so we found that because there was an increase in numbers, from that in that age group, and a lot of the money wasn't going there. It wasn't really helping the cause. So Mac decided to put out a video or a movie that they placed on Netflix, and this was specifically about kids and AIDS. And instead of putting Mac all over it, which they easily could have done, at the very end they decided we're just going to put Mac in the small right-hand corner of the very last few seconds of the video. And what they realized was that the marketing and buzz about the cause, AIDS, jumped by about 150 to 300%, depending on what metric you look at. And it really talks about how authentic, it really talks about how authentic really, funds or foundations or, missions should be in terms of what they're trying to effectuate. Because Mac saw a double in its sales as a result of this campaign. So if you don't think about the financial, maybe you will be rewarded. But like I said, it's much more sustainable to be true to your cause. So Mac AIDS is a very good example of that. All right, so this one. Yeah, I think it's pretty self-explanatory. One of the things when I was reading through a bunch of these articles to try to give you guys the best examples of why all this stuff is really important. And I read this study from INSEAD which talks about, we talk about IQ and EQ, and nobody really knows how to define EQ. It's just emotional intelligence. How do you measure it? There are so many different ways, but it's not really standardized in a lot of ways. But one of the things that they found out was that a high level of emotional intelligence is actually very correlated with leadership effectiveness. So one of the things I do with my employees is I sort of just call them in and we talk about different things. I don't like to, talk about work necessarily all the time, and I don't like them to call me sir. Sometimes I tell them just call me Jay, and I realized that I've been able to develop a better camaraderie, and that was one of the things I talked about in the first slide, where becoming an engineer is something that requires a lot of intuition. And I have been able to construct myself into an engineer of organizational change and management, and I'm still furthering myself on that path, but it's been really great to see the kind of liveliness and camaraderie that is around the office. Another thing we know is that employee satisfaction leads to customer satisfaction. The internal is very much reflected in the external. I mentioned earlier autonomous work teams. We used to have managing directors for each one of our units. So for our rice unit, our soap unit, and our edible oil unit. But like I was mentioning about the power paradigm before, when there's a unity of command and when things have to go through a centralized person, there's usually corruption or abuse of power. And so we found that decentralizing things, which is a lot of what the various examples that I gave you about teal organizations are doing, are sort of moving decisions down the line, trying to let the people who know their job actually create the job for the better. Another thing we know, generosity, it's really good for your health. It has profound effects on serotonin, and so I encourage you to be generous, basically. By 2020, we also know that depression is going to be the largest effectuating ailment in the world. So I encourage all of you to be around positive people and cultivate that spirit in various organizations that you take part in or seek to start. Bring your hobby to the workplace. Some people have hobbies that don't require censorship, so I talk about those. I don't talk about those, rather. I'm talking about, there are companies like Sounds True, for example, which are spiritual publishers, for example, and one of the things they allow is to bring your dog to work. People would probably think that that's pretty crazy, but you can just imagine what he says to that. He's definitely not very thrilled. But one of the things I like to do is I have a whiteboard in my room, and I always write, something from a Buddhist text or from a Hindu text, and we'll just ponder about it throughout my day, and have employees come into my office, and they often come when I'm in the middle of doing something, so I tell them to hold on, and they sit down, and they start reading things on my board, and then we have conversations about it, like I talk about, really understanding your employees, delving deep. This is a really important component, and I know a lot of you maybe don't have interest in spirituality, a lot of you do, but I think it's important to actually know about it. I've been speaking to someone here who's an atheist, and it's really interesting how he really respects higher thought in this regard, and so knowing about it is better than not knowing about it. Believing it is something that is very personal. That's something I don't necessarily have an opinion about. Knowledge sharing, one of the things I like to do is bake cakes. I have an extremely bad sweet tooth. I was home in New York about 2 months ago. I was learning how to bake vegan, soy-free, gluten-free cakes. A lot of you are probably like, I don't want to eat that cardboard. But it's pretty good, and like one of the things I like to do is bring that stuff into the office, even though the cake doesn't look pretty and it doesn't taste as good as a normal cake. It's still a cake and it does its job. So I would encourage you to do the same. Maybe not with cakes, but with other things you love. All right, continuously develop yourself. Just gave you an example of how I really stepped out of the box and learned how to bake cakes. I've also been taking guitar lessons. I'm not Atif Aslam, I'm not great, but I can definitely do a little bit. It's really important to continuously develop yourself because you can be very static in a position like mine. I'm so engrossed in my work that it's difficult to think outside of the box. For the longest time, I was doing the operations, the managerial, and strategic elements of the organization, and I've sort of been able to segment those. And like we were saying about decentralization, the self-management, autonomy, move a lot of those decisions down the line, and allow myself to think in a more strategic way. I'm going to talk about the last point first, because mind wandering is one of the things we said we were trying to minimize as a result of meditation. But I didn't say how much meditation is required, and I didn't say that because of this. Mind wandering is extremely important for creativity. And there should be a balance between mind wandering and the effects that meditation has on mind wandering, because you cannot completely eliminate mind wandering. It will continue to persist to a certain degree, but with meditation you're able to snap in and out of it a lot better. So that's why we talk about focus and chaos. And like I mentioned earlier, creativity can actually be taught. And so there are various tools that enable you to be boxed in, where you can create within a certain apparatus. And I know it sounds very abstract, but I'm more than willing to share those tools with you at another time. So essentially, practicing, trying out new things creates more gray matter in your mind, which is basically where the neurons start to form and connect more within one another, creating better pathways and better response time, like I mentioned in the meditative area. And humanities. I was having a discussion with somebody last night about humanities and education, not only here in India, but back at home. One of the things I do is I run a foundation at home called Dharma Foundation, and what we try to do is revive interest in the humanities and within certain subsectors of the humanities, specifically with respect to East and South Asian faiths. And we talked about last night how there's a dearth of interest in the humanities sector here, and I think that's one of the things India really has to leverage. I've written a few articles before about how Buddhism is an ambassador of India, and we don't harness things like ancient thought as much. We use it more for political power than we do for cooperatism. And I think it's really important that all of us, which have lineage to such a rich history, a rich tradition, actually take interest in it, because it's very easy to be money motivated and say, I want to be an engineer, a doctor, businessman, etc. But there's only so much purpose in all of that, and as we mentioned, the sense of self-identity, contribution, and purpose are of extreme importance to one's overall success. So I encourage you to also look outside the material motivations and try to develop a better sense and a more holistic sense, rather, about what it is you want out of life. This is the founder of an organization called 2041, and what its mission is to save the Antarctic, and his idea behind that has motivated him to actually walk to both North and South Pole, and he talks a little bit about that, and I think it's extremely important that you gain from his wisdom.
Sure of 4 things for the rest of my life. First and foremost, I'm sure I hate bloody walking, I've done enough. Secondly, at a temperature of minus 73 degrees Celsius, it's quite chilly. At that temperature, sweat turns to ice inside your clothing. So the second thing I'm sure of is I do not enjoy having ice in my underpants. It's yet to thrill. Thirdly, after 57 fairly tough years so far on the planet, no insurance company has got the courage to give me life cover. No one will cover me. You'll understand why. And lastly, and it's really relevant to us here now, is what people say to me before we undertake a mission? 2 things. First, you're going to fail, Rob. Secondly, you're going to die, Rob. And Steve won't mind me saying, when I think of these people, I call them the positive bastards. I ask you a simple question: how many times have you been into a room with really gloomy, negative people and come out and felt better? The answer's no. So all of us here have to, in our missions, our journeys, have to be the positive person, because no one is ever inspired by negative. And I've tried and failed, but I keep trying to live my life by the following words: if you can do or dream you can, begin it now, for boldness has genius, power and magic in it. I try. Now imagine walking to the South Pole across a continent twice the size of Australia, and a map of where you're going looks like the screen. Nothing! You get there. I lost 69 pounds in 70 days. It was hard. And then you find yourself by a series of aeroplanes standing at Heathrow Airport looking a bit thin. You haven't had a proper bath or shower for a year. It's even extreme for an Englishman. You haven't seen your girlfriend for a year. There's lots of excitement. But the first thing you're told is you have to go on a TV chat show with 20 million viewers, and the first question you're asked is, was it cold, Bob? But eventually they get around to one good question, and it's fabulous what you said, our gymnast. Dreams. I was lucky. I saw a film when I was 11 about the Antarctic, and I wanted to become the first person in history to walk to both poles. Everybody laughed. Everybody said it couldn't happen, but we did it in the end. We had to spend years raising money, $5 million US. We sailed south from the great city of London, and it gets a bit chilly as we're coming towards the Antarctic. An amazing place, the only place in the world that all of us still own, all of us. Then 3 of us undertook a journey, no radio communications. No fancy GPS buttons where you press a button and it tells you where you are. No, the longest unassisted march ever made anywhere on earth in history. Pulling on our backs 370 pounds in weight, 9 hours a day, 7 days a week. If you fall down a crevasse in the Antarctic, you don't come back. And we had to learn something which is hugely important of how you move on from this evening. Trust each other, because trust is efficient. Push away doubt, trust. And we had to trust each other fully with our lives. Sometimes
I definitely tried to live my life with that purpose, because I know I have enough as it is, but I want more, and I want more for others. So I hope all of you will live with the same passion and fervor, and make all your dreams come true. So thank you very much.